Hi everyone. So in this video, we're going to be talking about the different types of reproductive methods in general. So if organisms are undergoing asexual or sexual reproduction and what that basically means with respect to advantages or disadvantages to use that mode of reproduction. And this is basically going to be used as our introduction to human reproduction. So why is reproduction important? So if we think about the requirements to be considered a living organism, so there's actually 5. So the first requirement is to have at least one cell. The second requirement is to grow and repair. The third requirement is to use energy to function. The fourth requirement is to respond to stimuli. And the last is the ability to reproduce. So this is actually the 5th requirement to be considered living. So if you do not meet if you do not meet all of the 5 requirements, you are not considered a living organism. So that means anything that is living must reproduce. So it's how organisms produce offspring. So offspring is our scientific term for the progeny, which is another word that I just said, basically the babies of your individuals, of your original species. Now, the reason why we use offspring is because when you're talking about asexual reproduction, which is things that protistas, bacteria, and single cell fungi do, well, you have one cell that is forming another one cell. So that would be considered the offspring. Okay. And it's basically leading to the survival of the species. Because if we think about it from a practical point of view, if we're talking about a species, any species, so let's say we have a species of a particular flower, and that flower stops producing seeds. Well, if every organism in that type of flower stops producing seeds, you cannot have new sprouts. So the species dies. The same thing like if there's drastic virus that happens to a population of a particular animal that causes all of the animals to become infertile, the entire species would die. So to reproduce ensures the survival of that particular species. So we have 2 types of reproduction. So asexual reproduction, so this is going to be reproduction that is usually done by organisms that are only one cell. And those are pretty much things that are bacteria, protists, and some fungi. Sexual reproduction are going to be done by organisms that are more complex, so 2 or more cells, which are pretty much going to be plants and animals. Now, for individuals that undergo asexual reproduction, you only need one organism to form offsprings. So, which is very different from sexual reproduction, where you need 2 organisms that have different sex cells. So your gamete is the term for a sex cell. So for individuals that undergo sexual reproduction, you have to have a male sex cell and a female sex cell. And each of these sex cells are going to have 50% of the genetic info needed to produce the offspring. Whereas for asexual reproduction, because you only have one organism, it is going to introduce 100% of the genetic information needed to reproduce, meaning that in asexual reproduction, the offspring is genetically identical to the parent. So basically, they're forming a clone. Whereas in sexual reproduction, because you have 50% of the genetic information contributed by the male sex cell and 50% of the genetic information contributed by the female sex cell, it is inherently different from both parents, and it will inherit some of the characteristics of each parent. Because asexual reproduction is genetically identical, the only time there is genetic differences in the parent and the offspring is if there is mutation. Now, mutation basically means that when you are copying the genetic information, there is a copying error. And because there is a copying error, the original genetic code and the new genetic code is different. Mutation doesn't necessarily mean good or bad, it just means different. So mutation is usually caused by a copying error. So if it's mutated, it means that there is an error in DNA copying. Now, since sexual reproduction has 50% of the genetic information from one parent and 50% of the genetic information from the other parent, it is genetically different, so not identical, which leads to a lot of genetic diversity. So our types of reproduction: asexual and sexual reproduction. Now, I did say that mostly bacteria, protists, and fungi do asexual reproduction. There are instances of certain species that do sexual reproduction, but those are usually for emergency purposes only, in the sense that these species normally do sexual reproduction, but if there is a drastic need to reproduce because the survival of the organism is at risk, then it will do asexual reproduction. So organisms that do this would be like starfish, flatworms, strawberries reproduce by asexual reproduction because they form runners, and then you have buddings off of the runners. And when you're doing a tree cutting, where you take a branch of a tree and then you put it in water and that produces roots, that would be considered asexual reproduction. But they're not the norm when it comes in plants and animals, because plants and animals, all of the examples that I just said, also do sexual reproduction. Okay, so if we're looking at advantages for asexual reproduction, one, it's quite quick. Why is it quite quick? Because more often than not, the organism is just one cell. So it's just copying one cell. So you can actually have a copy, so you can have a parent producing an offspring in anywhere between 10 to 20 minutes. So that is drastically quicker than what it takes for human offsprings to be produced, which is 9 months. So much quicker. Also, because asexual reproduction only requires one individual, you don't have to find a mate. Now, in certain populations, this might be actually more difficult. So especially when you have at-risk animal species populations, where you have a high majority of one sex over the other, well, if everything is just one sex, then you cannot reproduce. So you can have things like that where finding a mate does become difficult. And there's little parental investment. Well, considering that the organism's usually one cell, you don't need to do any of the parental investment that you would have to do for individuals that undergo sexual reproduction, because usually they are sentient beings that have to be taught to hunt, to fish, social interactions, all of those things, which requires parental investment. And as I said, certain organisms that produce sexually normally can do asexual reproduction, but it's very, very specific. So this would be things like starfish, things like flatworms, plants like strawberries, Those would be key examples. But again, everything that I just mentioned normally do sexual reproduction. Now, disadvantage. There's no genetic diversity because it is, again, a clone. So because there is no genetic diversity, they are prone to go to extinction much quicker. So if there is a bad gene that is involved in the organism, well, everyone in the species has the same bad gene and can go extinct much quicker. And because there is no genetic diversity, they cannot adapt to drastic situations, which leads to the prone to extinction. For sexual reproduction, so advantage, number one, there is a lot of genetic diversity. And the reason why there is a lot of genetic diversity is because, again, 50% of the genetic information needed to form the offspring comes from the biological male, and then 50% of the genetic information needed to form the offspring comes from the biological female. So because you have that genetic diversity, they can adapt faster because you'll have a greater number of different genes in the population, and they're less likely to go extinct as fast as individuals that do asexual reproduction. Disadvantage is that it's time consuming. Whereas asexual reproduction, you can have an offspring in about 10 minutes. For sexual reproduction, you need weeks, months, and in some cases, years. But it's very rare. Mostly the gestation period is weeks to months. And you need two organisms of the opposite sex. So that means if you have a species that is at risk of going extinct and the last female dies and the only living organisms that you have left of that species is male, or vice versa, they cannot reproduce because you need, again, genetic information from the male cell and the female cell. So if we're going to be looking at a breakdown between sexual and asexual reproduction, well, the one thing that they have in common is they produce offspring. Asexual reproduction is going to be producing offspring that are going to be genetically identical, whereas sexual reproduction is going to be producing offspring that are genetically unique. So this right here is a very big difference between the two. The second way is how they produce offspring. Sexual reproduction has to do with fertilization. So you're going to have your ovum, which is going to be your female sex cell. So the ovum is the female sex cell or the female gamete, which is fertilized by the sperm, which is the male sex cell. Whereas in asexual reproduction, the way that they do it, because it's usually organisms that are just one cell large, is something called binary fission, which basically means I have the cell, the nucleus copies itself, the cell elongates, and then the cell wall forms in between the two parts of the cell. So this is basically our overview of sexual versus asexual reproduction. Thank you for watching.